Chapter 7 Dark Visions. Silas walked with heavy feet along the grassy trail in front of him. Birds chirped in the surrounding trees, almost as though they were laughing at his pain. How many days has it been now? 4? 5? He was beginning to lose track. The muscles in his legs felt stiff as they carried his body closer and closer to the city called Gelendor. He couldn't wait to get there. Geode was doing his best to keep many stories about the city a secret in order to surprise them when they arrived. But Torin, Samara, and himself had been able to squeeze a few details out of the warrior. The capital of nature. If anything that Geode had said was true, it might just be the most amazing place that Silas would ever visit. A curious sensation, like a whisper, told him that Gelendor would be only the beginning. It tickled the back of his mind, but the feeling quickly faded as the bottoms of his feet ached and complained. Looking up from the ground in front of him, Silas directed his voice towards Uthrin. "How much further is it to Gelendor? Please tell me we're getting close."
"We still have about another week's journey until we get there," Uthrin replied. "I would estimate we are about halfway there."
Audible moans came from not only Silas, but also Samara and Torin. Uthrin turned his head towards them, a sly smile curling up his lips.
"You are all going to have to get used to traveling long distances. We aren't going to be in Gelendor for too long, I'd imagine. There will be much more strenuous, long journeys ahead of us."
"Can't we rest for just a minute?" Samara complained, slowing her pace slightly. "I'm starving and need a break." Uthrin looked into the sky, noting the midday position of the sun. He sighed, shaking his head.
"We really should keep a good pace, but I suppose a small rest wouldn't kill us. I'll agree, as long as we can put in a small training session while we rest."
"Deal!" Torin, Samara, and Silas exclaimed in unison. Taking a few more steps towards an inviting grassy area, Uthrin dropped his pack and sat down on a slightly rotting, fallen tree.
"Geode, if you and Torin are not too fatigued, this would probably be a good time to continue with your combat training as well."
Geode looked over at Torin. Torin grinned widely.
"I'm always ready for more training."
Torin reached into his bag and pulled out some dried fruit, shoved it in his mouth, then drew his sword and held it high in the air as if he were trying to channel a lightning bolt to come down and energize his blade. He let out a battle cry, then slashed his sword down and did a spin move. Cocking his sword arm into a jabbing position and holding his left hand out in front of him, thumb and 2 fingers extended, he raised his left knee to his chest, closed his eyes, and let out a controlled breath of air. He opened his eyes and saw the rest of his companions frozen in their actions, staring at him wide-eyed. He turned his head and saw Geode with his face in his palm. Torin's face turned red, a bead of sweat forming at the back of his neck as he lowered his leg and sheathed his sword. Clearing his throat, he sheepishly notified everyone that he would be over there, and quickly scurried away. Laughter quickly filled the trees as the group teased Torin. Although he was still embarrassed, Torin couldn't help but smile. He was glad that he had the gift of lightening the mood and making people smile, even if it was spawned from an embarrassing moment. Geode pushed himself to his feet, still stifling a bit of laughter, then headed off to begin his session with Torin. Uthrin cleared his throat.
"I promised that we would learn more techniques after your speed at opening your second mind had improved, and neither of you has left me disappointed. You will continue to get faster and faster as we train, but for now, your speed is sufficient. However, before moving on to offensive techniques, I have one very important defensive spell that I would like you to learn."
Uthrin made the symbol of light, and his hands and eyes began to glow. He then broke the symbol and held one of his hands outstretched.
"As you both have already witnessed, shielding can be very useful during the heat of battle. It can be used to protect yourself or an ally from danger. While the shield is very powerful and will block almost any amount of damage directed towards you, it's not fail-proof. If too much damage is directed towards your shield, the damage will be blocked, but the shield will then dissipate, and you will need to conjure another in its place. For now, however, we shouldn't be running into many enemies that will challenge the strength of your shields."
A yellow sphere appeared around Uthrin's hand as he finished talking. The light swirled in a slow, even pattern, almost like a liquid caught in a slow whirlpool. It was deceptively thin and looked as if a blade would easily penetrate its shell, although Silas knew better. Uthran reached into his pocket and with his other hand pulled out his knife, handing it to Silas. Silas hesitated for a moment, then called to remembrance the shield that had been placed around him when the Black Hand had attacked, as well as the shield that Uthran had placed upon Samara, protecting her from getting her throat slit. He took in a small breath, then stabbed at Uthran's hand with the knife. The tip of the blade struck the glowing yellow power of the light magic, feeling like it had just been slammed into a wall. The tip of the blade shot to the side, as if the light had not only blocked the blow, but also commandingly rebuked it. His wrist twisted at the impact, almost making him lose his grip on the knife.
Light naturally wants to protect, so conjuring powerful shields is a simple task, even for beginners. One is also able to control the size of the shield, like so.
The light swirling around his hand quickly expanded, the energy pulsating like a living, alien form of liquid. In moments it was large enough to surround Uthran's entire body, encasing him with a protective barrier.
I can also shape it to my body, donning the armor of the light.
The light again glowed more luminous as the size changed, shrinking down to just around Uthran's one hand until it looked almost as if it had turned into a thin glove of light.
The size of the shield is the easy part to control, but the strength of it, how much damage it can block without being broken, is where the practice and mastery kicks in. The stronger you are as a mage, the more powerful your shields will become.
The light faded from Uthran's hand, and his eyes stopped glowing as he gestured to Silas to return his knife. Silas handed the knife back to Uthran as he continued to speak.
As I was saying, light naturally wants to protect those whom it deems worthy, so providing protection is not difficult. The more that you can persuade the light that the object or person that requires protection is holy and just, the stronger the protection will be. If you are trying to convince the light to protect yourself, it makes it even easier. Now, it's your turn. Both of you open your second minds, and we'll continue from there.
Silas and Samara both made the symbol of light with their hands. Within a couple of seconds, their eyes and hands began to glow with the yellow color of light magic. Uthran nodded in satisfaction.
We'll start with shielding yourselves before moving on to protecting others. Concentrate on your second mind, and align your wills together with the desire to create a shield around your right hand.
Almost in unison, Silas and Samara broke the symbols they were making and stretched their right hands out in front of them. Silas concentrated on his second mind and its desires. He tried to think in words that Uthran might use, telling his second mind that he needed to prove himself worthy of further instruction in the sacred art of light magic by creating a divine shield around his hand. His second mind seemed to really like the flowery language, immediately agreeing that this cause was just and that the task should be done. Silas noted how much the influence of light tugged at the conscience of his second mind. It wanted to be used and show forth its power. It just needed a vessel that was provided by himself. With his desires aligned, Silas willed the task to be done, and a yellow sphere of light encircled his hand. Samara had similar success, a bright yellow glow radiating around her hand as well. Uthran held his knife out in front of Silas and asked him if his desires were pure and just. Silas nervously nodded, then felt the rebuke of his second mind. It told him to be confident, to not shy away from his divine potential. Feeling the boost of confidence, Silas nodded once more. Uthran's hand shot forward, stabbing the knife towards Silas's shield. The light around his hand glowed brightly as the tip of the knife bounced off its edge. The light grew as his confidence at seeing his success increased, his sense of holy power and desire to provide protection from evil flaring the power of his shield spell.
Light is a very confident element,
Uthran explained as if he'd read Silas's feelings.
As your confidence in yourself and the element increases, your power with the light will also increase. Well done. Samara, are your intentions pure and your actions holy?
Yes, you will not harm me. Uthran smiled at the apparent influence of light in her voice. He flipped the knife in his hand, displaying an expertise with the blade that Silas wouldn't have guessed the old man to have, then slashed the knife at Samara's hand. The blade bounced off, just as it had done with Silas, but added to it a slight booming noise and a flash of light that sent Uthran's arm sprawling backwards. Uthran shook his arm, rubbing out the pain.
Outstanding, Samara. You seem to have an aptitude for light magic. Time will tell. Now, I want each of you to concentrate on moving the shields from your hands, and this time placing them upon each other. Change your desires from being self-centered to being protective of your friend. Increase the size of the shield as well, so that it's covering the entire body.
The two apprentices concentrated, slowly moving their orbs of light towards each other. Silas focused on how much he cared for Samara as he pushed his shield towards her. A burning sensation filled his soul, a deep desire within his second mind to protect her at any cost. The light from his shield radiated even brighter as his desires aligned, and he found it easy to extend the sphere around her entire body. Samara also had success in moving her sphere around Silas and extending it to cover his whole body. Uthran readied his knife, his eyes becoming fierce.
Samara, protect your friend!
The old man lunged out with the knife, stabbing it ferociously at Silas. Silas winced slightly, but was relieved when once again the blade bounced off the shield that was surrounding him and was sent backward defiantly. Uthran shook his arm from the rejection, and with a pleased look congratulated Samara for her excellent protection. Readying himself, he once again took an aggressive position, this time towards Samara.
Silas, protect your friend!
As Uthran swung his knife towards Samara, time slowed nearly to a stop. His second mind flared with rage, the light dominating his thoughts. He tried to control his anger, knowing that Uthran did not intend to actually harm Samara. It wasn't enough. His second mind was being dominated by the light. Its desires to prevent Uthran from attacking Samara were overwhelming. The light forced its will upon his own, taking complete control of his actions. Time sped back up as he yelled, "Don't hurt her!" The energy from his shield grew brighter and brighter, the shield expanding outward and actually attacking Uthran. Its circular shield form changed shape to form a deadly point of light, like a spear cast down directly from the heavens. The spear lunged forward, eager to sink its tip into its opponent, striking down at his enemy in holy vengeance. With the speed and mastery of a true legend, Uthran moved his hands into the symbol of light and quickly radiated with the same holy energy. He swirled his hands in front of his body, catching the spear of light within his palms. Silas felt the magic slowly fade from his body, its will and power obeying a new master now. Uthran's long white hair flowed wildly, as if a powerful wind had suddenly been blown towards him. The light swirled in between his palms as he slowly pressed his hands together, then all at once disappeared into nothing, the power having been completely absorbed by the powerful man. Silas fell to his knees and felt his second mind close as the light left him completely. Breathing heavily from the loss of control, he looked over at Uthran. "Uthran, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. The light, it took control." Uthran closed his eyes, releasing a breath of air as the magic around his body faded.
You can't let the elements take over you, Silas. It's imperative that you always stay in control. If you lash out with the untamed and unbridled power of the elements when they are out of your control, it could prove fatal, not only to those around you, but also to yourself.
His voice was stern, but in there was a kind understanding.
I know it's hard. The elements can be difficult to control at times. As you continue to practice, it will get easier. I'll help you to control those outbursts as best as I can, with tips that I have found helpful during future training sessions.
His sternness faded as a smile curled up his lips.
Good job on protecting Samara, though. If I weren't quick, I would have been in trouble.
Silas allowed himself to release a small chuckle, but the painful thought of almost attacking Uthran still ate at him. "I'm really sorry. I don't know what came over me." "I felt something similar when Uthran was attacking you, Silas," Samara said, touching his arm. "I didn't want to see you get hurt. I knew that Uthran was just trying to teach us, but still a part of me wanted to lash out and stop him. I was able to focus my thoughts and tell myself that my desires were only to protect and not to harm. I sort of whispered it to myself, and it seemed to help me."
There have been many mages that have been consumed by the elements they were attempting to wield, Uthran explained. The power that the elements contain cannot be treated lightly, and one must always proceed with caution when attempting to use them. Remember, you are not just using them, you are uniting yourself with them, then directing them in a manner that you desire. Control is the true key to mastering magic.
Silas nodded, feeling slightly better.
All in all, I think you both did quite well. There's still a lot of room for improvement, of course, but you are both progressing much faster than I could have hoped. Perhaps tomorrow we'll talk about control and do some planned offensive magic.
Uthran gave him a wink.
Until then, we'd better keep moving. Silas, can you please let Geode and Torin know that we are ready to leave?
Silas headed off towards where Geode and Torin were sparring. He was still upset that he let the light overpower his will and take control. How could he not be? In his heart, he vowed to himself that he would never let that happen again. The images of two sparring figures grew closer as he approached, the sound of wood on wood clanking together with audible thuds. Torin took a step back and ducked under the swing of Geode's staff, then lunged his wooden training sword towards the chest of the nature mage. Geode easily parried the blow as he spun his staff in front of him in a quick circle. Geode's eyes met Silas, and Torin took the moment of distraction as an opportunity of attack. He attempted to use the momentum from being parried aside to spin around and make a mighty swing at Geode. As soon as his back was turned, Geode brought his staff down on Torin's back with a loud slap, dropping him to the ground. Torin gasped for air as his face hit the dirt.
"What have I told you about turning your back to your opponent?" he said in a gruff voice. "Those types of moves are never practical and will only get you killed. By the time you actually spun your body to face me again, I could have struck you several times."
Torin choked on air that refused to enter his lungs. He slowly pushed himself off the ground and onto his knees. He tried to respond, but the wind had been forced out of his body with the blow, and all he managed was a wheeze.
"You need to learn to focus on what strikes are most efficient, not the ones that everyone will tell stories about around the campfire. I know that you want to live up to the reputation of your father, but you aren't going to be able to do that while making these silly moves of yours."
Geode walked to the front of Torin and held out his hand. Taking it, Torin stood, and after a few more moments of breathlessness, was finally able to take in a gasp of air. "Yes, master," he finally said. "I guess I was trying to be like him. I won't do it again. You have my word." Geode placed a kind hand on his shoulder.
"I've heard stories about your father, Torin. Believe it or not, I've even heard about your grandfather. One day you'll be just as skilled as they are. I know you will. For now, though, let's keep our focus on the basics."
He smiled and patted Torin's shoulder.
"Are we ready then, Silas?"
"Yeah, I was just coming to get you. We're headed out soon."
"Very well. Let us be off."
Geode faced Torin and put his fists together, giving him a respectful bow. Torin repeated the gesture and bowed back, then bent down and picked up his wooden sword off of the ground and slid it into its leather holster. Torin and Silas walked together, following the mighty Geode a few paces behind his own. "How did your training go, Silas?" Torin asked. With a slight hesitation, Silas responded a bit less enthusiastically than Torin expected. "It was good. We went over shields today." "Oh man, that sounds awesome. So, were you able to do it then? Did you make a shield?" "Yeah, I made one. It even blocked Uthrin's knife when he tried to stab through it." "Well, that's great. So, why do you seem so down? I thought you'd be happy with that." Silas let out a breath of frustration and recounted the little mishap to Torin. "It was like the light's influence was more powerful than my own. It just took over and made me lash out. I feel terrible about it."
"Don't let it get you down, Silas,"
Geode said, turning his head towards them.
"Taming the elements and learning to control the desires of your second mind isn't easy, especially with the elements that have strong wills. Light is kind of a tough one, to be honest. Not that it's particularly hard to use, just that it's hard to tame it. It just seems to have an unyielding will to do what it sees as righteous all the time. It can sometimes be hard to sway in the direction that you desire."
"Is nature the same way?"
"Nope,"
he said with a smile.
"Nature is much different. Well, I guess I wouldn't say it like that. Nature wants to do good, just like the light does, and it has a strong desire to protect, just like the light. Why, it can even heal just like the light does. But nature is much more calm and easily persuaded. As long as the user has a calm and peaceful mind, it simply wants to be used to further growth and life, and to protect against anything that would destroy life. It's content to let you steer it in whatever direction falls into those simple categories."
Silas kicked a pebble and watched it roll across the dirt. "It would be nice to use a more relaxed element." "Maybe one of these days you could teach me about nature magic?" Silas asked. "I'm also really interested in learning combinations too. Uthrin keeps telling me about them and how useful and powerful they can be.
Ah, now that's where the magic gets fun,
Geode said with a smile.
It's not easy, and I'd recommend you at least get down the basics, plus some more advanced stuff before trying to combine the elements. But I'm telling you, real magic is when you can mix them all together to exactly fit your needs.
He slowed himself so that Silas was walking directly by his side.
I'd be happy to teach you some nature magic sometime, though. That way you can see the difference between it and the light. Maybe after you get both of them down, we can work on mixing the two. You'd like that. It's a real, colorful combination. Useful, too.
A mysterious, almost mischievous look passed over Geode's lips as he continued walking. Aren't you going to tell us what it is? Torin asked.
Nope. Basics first, my young apprentices. Basics first.
He ended his sentence with a slight laugh, obviously proud of his little secret. Is there any advantage to choosing one element over another? Silas asked, eager to dig deeper into Geode's knowledge. Or even advantages with using combinations or sticking to one element?
Geode shrugged. It's kind of just preference. Well, there's a bit more to it than that, but I'll bet Uthrin teaches more about that later. Some like to focus solely on one or two elements, like Uthrin, for example. You haven't seen it just yet, but I've never seen someone able to bring so much spark to the battlefield. And that suits him just fine. For me, I like to explore. I like to have a good understanding about all the elements. Sure, nature comes the most easily to me, but that doesn't mean that I can't branch out and discover new things too. In the end, it's all up to you. Pick one, or pick 'em all. You're only as powerful as you work hard to be.
Arriving at the others, the group once again set off towards Gelendor. Geode mentioned to Uthrin that Silas had the desire to learn nature magic, and Uthrin agreed that it would be a good idea.
It's important that you find out which element naturally attunes to you, and that you learn it well. If you want to be equally rounded, that's always an option, but you should figure out which one you are naturally gifted in first. I think that it's beneficial, especially when you are first learning, that you find which element really speaks to you and get your basics cemented with that element first. Of course, I expect you to learn all of the elements and be at least somewhat proficient with each of them eventually, but I'd advise you to find and focus on the one that feels right to you first.
Do you know how to use all the elements then, Uthrin? Samara asked.
I, along with Geode, do know the basics of all the elements, yes, but I would not say that I am skilled with all of them. As you know, the elements all have their opposites: water and fire, nature and air, light and darkness. As I have found that my strengths belong to the light, you can naturally assume that my weakness would be that of darkness. I know several basic spells and have learned about what others can do with it, but I can't do anything very impressive. If you fancy learning darkness, Geode would probably be a better teacher than I, as he is very well rounded with most elements.
Uthrin hesitated, his step slowing just slightly before resuming.
But I would caution against starting with darkness so soon. It has a tendency to bring out some of the bad in you, but perhaps I'm just somewhat biased, as I'm naturally pulled towards the light.
Silas shook his head. I don't think I want to learn any darkness right now anyway. I do think that nature seems really cool, though. He hoped that maybe nature would be what he was naturally attuned to, whatever that meant. The abilities that Geode displayed when they were attacked by the Black Hand were incredible, and although he could see how useful it would be to be a Master of Light, nature seemed very appealing to him, especially the easygoing part.
I can teach you the symbol of nature tonight when we make camp, and we can go over some of the basics, Geode offered. If that's all right with Uthrin, anyway.
Silas turned towards Uthrin and was pleased to see him nodding in approval.
I think that would be appropriate. I'll continue to teach Samara about shielding in the meantime, and you can decide where you want to go from there, Silas.
Silas agreed, and the group continued their journey towards Gelendor. A smile spread across his face as he eagerly awaited the long day to end. Thoughts of controlling the trees, speaking to animals, and generally being like Geode danced in his mind as he walked. A strange feeling brushed against him between one of his thoughts. It was cold, like a shadow had been cast over him for just a moment. He stopped walking for a split second, looking around to see if anyone else had felt it. He quickly resumed his walk, the strange coldness now gone from him. He waited for the feeling to come back, but even after walking for some time, it never returned. Doing his best to shrug it off, he focused his eyes on the horizon. One day closer to Gelendor. Frogs and other boggy animals croaked in the night as Silas finished putting up his tent. The ground sank slightly beneath his boots, squishing water up between the blades of grass at his feet. It was a terrible place to camp, but the ground in this area seemed to be like this everywhere, so they'd just have to deal with it for tonight. Samara finished with her shelter as well, staking it out mere feet from Uthrin's. Silas didn't blame her. Even he had fearful thoughts crossing his mind in the night ever since the attack, and no one had held him at knife point. After setting up their tents and getting something to eat, Silas approached Geode, anxiously hoping that he would agree to start the nature training. Geode extended his muscular arm in front of him and motioned for Silas to sit down. A smile passed over his face, as it seemed to do the more that Silas interacted with the strong warrior.
"Have a seat, Silas. We'll start with a brief history."
Silas excitedly sat down and focused all his attention towards Geode. The light moon was full tonight, shining brilliantly and lighting up the area around him. A silvery beam of moonlight almost seemed to illuminate the silhouette of Geode, as if the light moon was attracted to him. He shrugged the idea off and paid close attention to the mighty mage's words.
"As Uthrin has already taught you, the original king of nature, who just so happened to be a woman in this case, don't ask me about their naming conventions, was Nymphara. She was bestowed with the knowledge of nature magic and its source of power. Look around you, Silas, and tell me what you think the source of power is for nature magic."
Slightly confused, Silas looked around and saw many things that could have been a source of power for nature. The trees, dirt, rocks, grass. None of them really stood out more than the others, though. Silas scratched his head and then looked up again at the moon. It didn't really seem connected to nature, but yet tonight it shone so brightly and seemed so alive. Is it the moon?
Very good. Yes, the light moon, specifically, is the source from which nature gains its power. During a light moon year, mages who use nature magic are able to feel greater power and clarity as they control that element. When it is a year of dark moon, you will not be able to feel that additional power, as the dark moon is the source of power for darkness. The trees and the earth and all living things have nature magic flowing within them, but it's the light moon that truly gives us strength and life. A night like this is perfect for learning to use nature magic. So, as the source of power for nature is the moon, the symbol for nature magic is appropriately shaped like a moon.
Geode held his hands out in front of him and made the symbol of nature by curving the fingers in his left hand to form a crescent shape, then with his right hand made an open circle and touched the middle of his bent pointer finger to the bottom of his outstretched thumb.
You'll find that tapping into your inner life and opening your second mind is the same with any element that you decide to use, so you should be able to tap into nature magic with little to no problem. Once it has been opened, however, your second mind will vastly differ from what you are used to feeling when using light. Nature is calm and collected, observant and peaceful. It's highly protective of all living things and destructive towards that which would harm the earth and its inhabitants. Go on, try it yourself. Make the symbol of nature like this, and open your second mind.
Silas did as he was instructed and made the symbol of nature with his hands, cupping his left hand to form a crescent, then making an open circle with his right and placing it below his left hand, middle knuckle on his pointer finger touching the fingernail of his thumb. He then reached into his pool of inner life and moved it from his stomach into his hands and saw a green glow start to emanate from them. He then closed his eyes and moved the energy to his head and, like he had done so many times before, began to imagine his soul leaving his body. Silas opened his eyes, but to his dismay, did not feel his second mind open, nor did he see Geode sitting right in front of him. Instead, he found himself in a vast graveyard. It was dark where he was. That, and somehow, there was a large dark void in the starry night sky where the moon should have been. It almost appeared as if time had impossibly transitioned into a dark moon year. Confused, he continued to survey the landscape around him and tried to orient himself. The graveyard was massive. Gravestones littered the ground around him. and large dead trees cast eerie shadows across the grass at his feet from large torches that surrounded the graveyard. The torches were unnatural, glowing with an eerie purple flame. Most of the gravestones were small slabs of stone with names engraved upon their faces. Others were massive pillars that stood several feet in the air with varying designs, cracking and faded with age. A flash of black and a loud caw made him jump. A black crow took flight from a sizable tomb-like building that stood off in the distance. As he peered into the darkness towards the building, he suddenly felt himself being whisked through the air until he was standing right in front of it. The tomb was made from a dark stone material and stood out about the same height as a one-level house. 2 stone pillars sat on either side of the door, holding up a stone slab which acted as a porchway. The pillars were cracking and faded, showing that they had been here a long, long time. The door to the tomb was made of a dark, thick, heavy wood with large iron braces holding its frame. Above the door was the same symbol that he had encountered in the ancient crypt, a large black skull that seemed to scream evil. The very image seemed to whisper dark thoughts into his mind. Silas quickly stepped back away from the tomb and heard what he could only describe as the sound of bones clanking against each other behind him. He spun around and met the purple gaze of a reanimated skeleton. One by one, additional skeletons seemed to fade into view, an entire host of once living warriors where he had been only moments before. The air inside his lungs choked in his throat. He tried to scream, but no sound came. Neither did his lungs allow him to breathe. His heart raced. His blood turned ice cold. A chill ran throughout his body, sending goosebumps down his neck and arms. The skeleton stared right at him, dark purple eyes peering directly into his soul. No, it wasn't looking at him. It was staring directly past him. The air he had been choking on softened, and he let it out slowly. He moved out of the skeleton's line of sight. Gratefully, the terrifying creature didn't react in any way. Each of the thousands of skeletons were glowing with the slightest of auras, a black color with a hint of purple radiating from their dry bones. The aura reminded him of flames, but flickering in a much slower, much softer fashion, like burning shadows. Their eye sockets were filled with a floating orb of dark purple light, centered where eyeballs would have been who knows how long ago. Each of the skeletons made a terrible clanking noise as bones rubbed on bones with every slight movement. Their dark eyes continued to stare at something unseen, something terrible. With terror gripping at his soul, Silas slowly turned to see what the animated skeletons were looking at. The scenery immediately changed, and he found himself standing in a dimly lit room, the smell of dust and stale air unwillingly entering into his nose. Coughing, he found himself staring into a large mirror. The mirror was leaning up against a wall and showed his reflection at just a slightly skewed angle. Silas approached the mirror. The closer he got, the clearer his image became. Coming to a stop in front of the mirror, he observed the bit of stubble that had formed on his chin and upper lip. He touched his face, his reflection exactly mirroring his movements. Like a nightmare, his reflection suddenly seemed to gain a mind of its own. He watched in horror as his reflection in the mirror started to smile. The smile stretched across his face, unnaturally long and thin. Evil dripped from the edges of his mouth deviously. His reflection then put its hand out in front of it and made a symbol that he had never seen before. His reflection made a small circle in each hand, using its pointer finger and thumb. It brought the 2 circles together, then extended each of its other 3 fingers in a diagonal, meeting them together at a point above the circles. It then proceeded to tip its hands forward until the symbol was upside down. The symbol greatly resembled the symbol of light. It was just different enough, though. Different enough to almost mock the light. That, and it was turned upside down, as to add even more mockery to its cheap imitation. His reflection's eyes and hands began to glow with dark purple magic energy. Slowly, it stretched its arms out to either side of its body. A dark purple ball of energy then formed in each of his outstretched hands, and with a laugh that was not his own, it threw the magic towards him. Acting purely out of instinct, Silas quickly made the symbol of light with his hands and attempted to open his second mind to create the shield of light around himself. As he tried to open his second mind, a deep purple light accompanied with the terrifying whispers of countless souls swept over him, knocking him to the floor. Sitting up, he found that he had again been transported to a different place. This time, he was somewhere near the mountains. He wasn't sure which mountains they were, but they did look somewhat familiar. Moments later, he was in the darkness of a small room. In front of him stood a giant statue of a man in armor that had the same symbol that Uthrin's battle mage robes had, sitting right in the center of his breastplate. The statue held a large maul. The length of the maul looked to be almost as tall as the man was if stood upright. The head of the maul was a large, bulky rectangular cube with intricate designs carved into it. As he looked at the maul, it began to fade slightly, and he found himself looking straight through the statue. Inside the head of the maul sat a bright yellow glowing stone. The only reason he was not able to see it before was most likely due to the thick metal that covered it. The statue then gained its thickness again, and he was no longer able to see through it. The statue started to crack and shake, and a gust of wind blew past it, crumbling it to dust. As the plume of dust faded away, a shadowy figure entered into his view. Malos sat on a large black throne, dark battle mage robes covering his body. His hood rested on his back as he sat, his eyes closed as he hunched forward and stared at the ground. Silas took a step backward in fear, the very aura of the dark mage's evil presence causing him to shake. As his foot touched the ground behind him, Malos opened his eyes and looked directly at him. His eyes met Silas's and terror flooded into his body. Malos stretched his hand out towards him, and Silas felt his soul being torn from his body. The pain was unreal. He felt as if his second mind was being forcefully opened, like his soul was about to be rent from his body unwillingly. Just as it seemed as though it was about to exit, a bright light swept over him, and Silas lost his strength and fell onto his back, his vision fading into darkness. His ears were ringing as he heard the muffled voices of people around him. He slowly opened his eyes and saw Geode, Uthrin, Samara, and Torin all gathered around him. The ringing in his ears slowly began to dissipate as his senses faded back into existence.
"Silas, are you all right? What happened?"
Uthrin said, reaching his hand towards him and placing it on his forehead.
"Are you hurt?"
I think I'm all right," Silas said as he sat up slowly. "I think I just had another vision. I saw Malos." Geode and Uthrin looked at each other, fear spreading across their faces.
"We must pack up and leave immediately," Uthrin whispered. "Torin, Samara, get your things and hurry," he exclaimed, raising his voice. "Malos will know where we are, and we'll have to travel through the night."
They nodded and immediately did as they were asked, and ran towards their tents.
"Silas, can you get up?"
"Yeah, I think so." He forced himself to yawn to try and get rid of the rest of the ringing that invaded his ears, then pushed himself to his feet. "I'm all right. I'll get my stuff." Uthrin held his shoulder with a strong hand, his old eyes worried as he peered into his own. He nodded, then left with Geode towards their tents to quickly pack for their untimely departure. Silas started running towards his tent, thoughts of having to face more warriors sent by Malos to kill them giving additional speed to his legs. The group finished packing, then traveled swiftly and silently through the tall grass and trees, the swishing of the grass joining the choir of insects and other animals in the night. After their first confrontation, Geode and Uthrin decided that instead of taking the most direct route towards Gelendor, it would be safer if they took a more roundabout way to the city to try and throw off any inclination of what direction they might be going. If any of their suspicions were correct, Malos was most likely able to pinpoint their latest location because of the vision, so it was essential to put as much distance between themselves and where they were as possible. Who knows how close his soldiers could have already been? After his first batch had failed, he probably sent more to pursue and track us down. Now that Malos saw right where we were, it's probably a matter of when, not if, they find us, Silas thought in anger. Stupid! Why did that happen again? He continued to ponder why he'd been successful in opening his second mind so many times when training with Uthrin with no incident whatsoever, just to let it happen to him again when trying to open it with nature magic for the first time. Several hours passed, and thankfully, no incidents. They continued to travel as silently as possible, only allowing their steps and labored breathing to make any noise. Silas watched the light moon as it slowly changed positions in the sky, along with the millions of stars that surrounded it. It was a beautiful, clear night, despite the temperatures continuing to grow colder and colder. He wished that he could enjoy looking at the stars in peace rather than running away from potentially a band of murderous henchmen. His train of thought was cut off when Geode immediately stopped moving and raised a hand into the air. He crouched down slightly and motioned for everyone else to do the same and drop their packs onto the ground. Silas's heart rate increased dramatically as his anticipation for horrible things he was sure were about to happen grew. In a low whisper, Geode told them that he thought he heard something. Like a silent bolt of lightning, a whooshing sound came flying through the air. A muffled grunt escaped Geode as a sickening thwack rang in the air. Silas's heart stopped as his eyes caught the terrifying sight of an arrow embedded into Geode's shoulder.